The assumption. The first-class cabin hummed with an air of quiet exclusivity, the soft clinking of crystal glasses blending with the rustle of luxury newspapers. Conversations, though hushed, carried the weight of wealth and power. Investment deals, corporate takeovers, luxury vacations planned in places most people couldn't pronounce. Leonard Montgomery sat in seat 1A, his posture relaxed, his presence unassuming. Dressed in a crisp black dress shirt, with the sleeves neatly rolled to his elbows, he exuded an effortless confidence. A sleek, expensive watch rested on his wrist, not the flashy kind, but the kind that only those who understood true wealth would recognize. His dark slacks were tailored to perfection, and his polished shoes rested lightly against the plush carpet. He blended in, and yet, in a way, he didn't. Leonard was accustomed to this space. He had spent years traveling first class, sometimes private, often unnoticed, which was how he preferred it. But today there was something different. A presence, a gaze. He could feel it before he even looked up. A few seats away, Denise Walker, the lead flight attendant for the first-class cabin, watched him from the corner of her eye. A veteran in the airline industry, she had worked thousands of flights, served countless VIPs, and could recognize a true first-class passenger the moment they stepped on board. She had seen CEOs who demanded champagne the moment they sat down, celebrities who expected their egos to be catered to, and self-important executives who made sure everyone in the cabin knew who they were. But then there were the others, the ones who didn't belong, the ones who walked in with an air of quiet discomfort, looking out of place in a space designed for the elite. Sometimes they were lucky upgrades, sometimes they were seat switchers, and occasionally they were trouble. Denise had developed a sixth sense for these things, and something about the man in one had just felt off. She passed by his seat once, then again, her trained eyes scanning for a clue. He was too calm, too unfazed. He wasn't checking emails like the usual executives, wasn't barking orders into a Bluetooth headset. He was just reading a magazine, like he had nowhere better to be. Something about that unsettled her. After a few moments of quiet deliberation, she approached his seat, stopping just beside him. Her expression was neutral, professional, but her voice carried a firm edge. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Leonard looked up, his deep brown eyes meeting hers with an expression that was neither surprised nor irritated, just calm, understanding. Yes, his voice was smooth, unwavering. Denise didn't break eye contact. "May I see your boarding pass?" Without hesitation, Leonard reached into his pocket, pulled out his ticket, and handed it to her. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't protest, didn't react. Just handed her the slip of paper like he had all the time in the world. Denise scanned the ticket quickly. Seat 1A first class. Verified. His name, Leonard Montgomery, matched the passenger manifest. Everything checked out. But still, something in her gut told her this wasn't right. She forced a polite smile as she handed the ticket back. "Thank you," she said stiffly, before turning away. Leonard slid the boarding pass back into his pocket and resumed reading his magazine as if nothing had happened. But Denise lingered at the front of the cabin, arms crossed, her eyes narrowing as she glanced back at him. Something wasn't adding up. She turned to Carla, another flight attendant who was preparing drinks in the galley. "Something's not right," Denise murmured. Carla glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Denise leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Passenger in 1A. He doesn't act like he belongs here." Carla frowned. "You checked his ticket, didn't you?" "I did. It's valid." "But—" Denise hesitated, jaw tightening. "I just have a feeling." Carla let out a quiet sigh. "Denise, come on. You know how this sounds." Denise ignored her, grabbing the flight manifest again and running her finger down the list of first-class passengers. Leonard Montgomery. The name was there. No upgrades, no last-minute switches. He was supposed to be here. And yet, "I'm going to find out," Denise muttered under her breath. The next move. Denise approached Leonard again, this time more deliberate, more certain that she had to get to the bottom of this. She stopped beside his seat, placing a hand on the headrest in front of him. "Sir, are you traveling alone?" Leonard lowered his magazine once more, his eyes meeting hers. This time, there was something behind them, a flicker of amusement, perhaps. "Yes, I am." Denise forced a smile. "And this ticket, it wasn't upgraded, was it?" Leonard's expression didn't change. He sat still for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the magazine before responding. "No, it wasn't upgraded. I purchased it." His voice was smooth, calm, uninterested in the game she was playing. Denise pressed on. "Do you mind showing me your ID?" A few heads in the first-class cabin subtly turned toward them, passengers catching on to the unusual exchange. Leonard exhaled quietly, closed the magazine, and reached into his pocket. He slid out his wallet, retrieved his identification, and handed it to her without a word. Denise took the ID, her eyes scanning the details. His name matched the ticket. His face was on the ID. Everything checked out. Again. But she still didn't move. She stood there for a second too long, gripping his ID, her eyes narrowing slightly as she stared at him. There had to be something wrong. Finally, Leonard spoke again, this time with a slight edge in his tone. "Is there a problem, miss?" The way he said it made something tighten in Denise's chest. There was something in his voice, not aggressive, not defensive, but firm. A warning. She swallowed, glancing at the ID one more time before finally handing it back. "No problem," she said, her voice clipped. "Enjoy your flight." Leonard took his ID and placed it back in his wallet. He didn't say anything else. He simply picked up his magazine and resumed reading. But Denise wasn't done. She turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the front of the plane, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. She was sure of it. The call. Denise stepped back into the galley, her breath coming a little faster than before. She wasn't sure why this was bothering her so much, but she couldn't let it go. She grabbed the in-flight phone and pressed a button to call the ground crew. The line clicked, and a voice on the other end answered. "Flight ops, go ahead." Denise straightened. "This is Denise, lead cabin crew for Flight 417. I need a ticket verification for a first-class passenger. Leonard Montgomery, seat 1A. There was a pause on the line, followed by the sound of typing. "Hold one moment." Denise tapped her fingers against the counter, her jaw tightening. Then the voice returned. His ticket was purchased under the name Leonard Montgomery. Paid in full. No upgrades. No irregularities. Denise's grip on the phone tightened. And then she made the mistake of asking one more question. "And there's nothing unusual. No last-minute changes. No special requests." More typing. Then a final response. "No, but his profile is locked." Denise's blood ran cold. "What do you mean locked?" "It means he's VIP. Very high level." Denise's stomach dropped. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The warning signs. Denise's fingers tightened around the in-flight phone as the words VIP, very high level, echoed in her head. Her breath hitched. She had been in the airline industry long enough to know that locked profiles were not standard. They were reserved for top executives, high-ranking officials, or individuals with unparalleled influence, people whose movements were protected for security and privacy reasons. And she had just interrogated one of them. Denise swallowed hard, forcing herself to sound composed. "Can you clarify what kind of VIP we're talking about?" The agent on the other end hesitated before responding. "Sorry, that's classified." Denise's stomach twisted. Classified. The word alone sent a chill through her. A passenger's identity being locked was one thing, but for the airline to outright refuse to disclose details, that was another level of power entirely. Denise clenched her jaw. She needed to think. She was trained to handle difficult situations. She had dealt with celebrities, politicians, and powerful businessmen before. She knew how to read people, how to anticipate issues before they happened. And yet, this time, she had miscalculated. Badly. Unraveling the truth. She slowly lowered the phone, placing it back into its holder. Carla, the other flight attendant, was watching her, arms crossed. "Okay, what's wrong?" Carla asked. Denise turned to her, exhaling sharply. "I think I might have just messed up." Carla raised an eyebrow. "With who?" "1A." Denise nodded, still trying to process everything. Carla let out a soft laugh. "Denise, I told you. You were looking for a problem that wasn't there." Denise didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for the crew tablet, navigating to the passenger manifest. When she located Leonard Montgomery's name, she tapped on it again. "Access restricted." Her heart pounded. Carla leaned over, her smirk fading. "Wait, why is it locked?" Denise shook her head. "I don't know, but this isn't normal." Carla's expression shifted from amusement to concern. "Denise, who the hell did you just question?" Denise didn't answer. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She felt nervous, deeply nervous. She turned toward the first-class cabin, her mind spinning. She had assumed Leonard Montgomery was just another businessman, possibly an imposter trying to finesse his way into first class. But now she wasn't sure. She had doubted the wrong man. And she was about to find out just how wrong she had been. Back to 1A. Denise stepped out of the galley, smoothing her uniform, trying to control her breathing as she walked toward seat 1A. The entire first-class cabin had settled. Passengers had returned to their drinks, their meals, their conversations. Some were watching the in-flight entertainment. Others were flipping through documents or scrolling through their phones. And then there was him. Leonard Montgomery. He was still sitting there, as composed as ever. Still unbothered. Still waiting. She felt it now, how he carried himself, how he wasn't trying to prove anything, how he simply existed in this space without question. The realization hit her like a freight train. He wasn't trying to prove he belonged here because he did belong here. More than anyone. Denise reached his seat, her fingers tightening at her sides. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Montgomery." Leonard finally looked up. His eyes met hers, and this time she felt something behind them, an expectation. He already knew why she was here. She could feel it. Denise forced herself to hold eye contact. "I wanted to confirm something with you." Leonard set his magazine aside, tilting his head slightly. "Go ahead." Denise hesitated for only a second before speaking. "You mentioned earlier that you purchased your ticket. May I ask?" She swallowed, feeling her own voice betray her. "Which airline you usually fly with?" A slow smile tugged at the corner of Leonard's lips. He leaned back in his seat, watching her, reading her. Denise's heartbeat was loud in her ears as she waited for his answer. And then, after a pause that felt entirely too long, he spoke. "This one." Denise's breath caught. A few passengers nearby turned their heads slightly. Leonard continued, his voice even, measured. "In fact, I don't just fly with this airline." He exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping the armrest, once before he delivered the words that made her stomach drop. "I own it." Silence. A heavy, crushing silence. Denise's world tilted. Her breath hitched. Her chest tightened. No way. She stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell her he was joking, to say something, anything, that would make this moment less terrifying. But he didn't. He simply watched her. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. She had just spent the past hour interrogating the owner of the entire airline. And now, her career was hanging by a thread. The weight of consequences. Denise felt paralyzed. Her face was burning, her pulse racing, her mind scrambling for an explanation, an excuse, anything that could undo what she had just done. But nothing came. A few seats away, passengers were whispering. Some of them were staring out right now, their expressions ranging from curiosity to sheer discomfort. Everyone in the first-class cabin had just witnessed her question a billionaire. Leonard Montgomery, the owner of the airline. The very man whose decisions could determine whether she had a job tomorrow. She had humiliated him, and he had let her. Not once had he raised his voice. Not once had he demanded an apology. Not once had he even hinted at his status. He had simply watched as she unraveled her own career in front of him. Denise forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat. "Mr. Montgomery, Leonard raised a hand, stopping her immediately. "No need," he said, his voice still impossibly calm. "I already know what you're going to say." Denise stiffened, and then, before she could respond, the in-flight phone rang. The sharp, intrusive sound cut through the tension in the cabin like a blade. Carla, standing in the galley, picked up. "Yes, Captain." A pause. Then, Carla's face paled. She turned to Denise, her expression unreadable. "The captain wants to see you." Denise's heart stopped. A few passengers gasped. Others shifted in their seats, their curiosity piquing. She turned back to Leonard. He was still sitting there, still composed, still in control. He took a slow sip of his water. Then, as he set the glass back on his tray table, he spoke one final time. "You should probably sit down." Denise couldn't breathe, because she knew exactly what was coming next, and it wasn't going to be good. The reckoning. The moment Denise stepped toward the cockpit, her world felt like it was closing in. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her chest, making every breath tight, every step heavy. The first-class cabin had fallen into an eerie silence, the usual hum of quiet conversations and rustling newspapers replaced by something far more dangerous: expectation. They were watching. They were waiting. They knew what she had done, and now they wanted to see what would happen next. And the worst part, so did she. A walk of consequences. As Denise passed the curtain leading to the galley, she barely registered Carla's hushed voice. "Denise, what the hell's going on?" She didn't answer. Because what could she say? That she had just humiliated the owner of the airline. That she had treated him like an imposter in his own first-class cabin. That she had failed the one thing flight attendants were trained to do: recognize and respect power. She pushed forward, each step feeling like she was walking toward her own execution. When she reached the cockpit door, she knocked once, her pulse pounding. The door unlocked immediately. That was a bad sign. Captain Reynolds stood inside, his uniform pristine, his posture rigid. His usually relaxed demeanor was gone, replaced by a sharp, unreadable tension. Beside him, First Officer Patel sat in his chair, eyes darting between the controls and the situation unfolding before him. Denise swallowed hard. "Sir." The captain didn't waste time. "Close the door." She did. Click. Now it was just the three of them. Reynolds exhaled, rubbing his temple like he was fighting the urge to curse. "Tell me exactly what happened." Denise hesitated, because how was she supposed to explain this? She had profiled a first-class passenger. She had assumed he didn't belong. She had gone out of her way to investigate him, to challenge him, to humiliate him. And then she had learned the truth. Leonard Montgomery was not just a first-class passenger. He was the owner of the airline. Denise took a breath and forced herself to speak. I questioned his seat, his ID. I thought." She stopped herself. No excuses. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You thought what?" She gritted her teeth. "I thought he didn't belong in first class." Reynolds closed his eyes for a brief second before letting out a slow, heavy breath. Patel, still silent, let out a low whistle. Denise felt sick. The cockpit was too small. The walls were too close. She needed air, but there was no way out. The verdict. Reynolds finally spoke again, his voice tight. Do you have any idea what you've done? Denise nodded, her throat dry. No. The captain's voice was sharper now. You don't. She flinched. Reynolds took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers with a cold, controlled anger. You didn't just question a first-class passenger. You didn't just make a mistake. You disrespected the man who owns this entire airline. Do you understand what that means? Denise barely nodded. She understood. And yet she still felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to be pushed off. The captain crossed his arms, his expression dark. You think you're the first flight attendant to make a mistake with a VIP? No. But you? He shook his head. You didn't just make an error. You doubled down. You called the ground crew. You questioned him, in front of an entire cabin of elite passengers. You didn't just humiliate yourself, Denise. You humiliated the airline. Her chest tightened. Because that was the real problem, wasn't it? It wasn't just about her. It was about the company's reputation. And in an industry where customer loyalty was everything, she had messed with the one customer they couldn't afford to lose. The owner. The power behind the entire operation. Reynolds rubbed his face, looking exhausted. Corporate's already been contacted. They're flagging your name for immediate disciplinary review. Denise's stomach dropped. She knew what that meant. It was one step away from termination. Her entire career gone. Her hands clenched at her sides. Sir, please. Reynolds cut her off. You're done for the day. When we land, you'll disembark with security. Denise froze. Security. The word hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a suspension. This was removal. She had seen it before. Crew members escorted off planes quietly, taken through back terminals, their IDs confiscated before they even had a chance to fight for their jobs. Denise's breathing shallowed. This was it. The end. She felt her hands shaking but willed herself to stay composed, stay professional. Because if she was going down, she wasn't going to beg. Reynolds gave her one last hard look. Go back to the galley. And don't say another word to Montgomery. Denise nodded stiffly. She turned, her legs feeling numb, and opened the cockpit door. As she stepped out, the hushed whispers of the first-class cabin greeted her. Everyone knew. They had heard everything. And then, as if the universe wasn't done crushing her, the in-flight phone rang again. The unexpected twist. Denise froze. Carla grabbed the phone, her brow furrowing. Yes. A pause. Then her eyes widened. She turned to Denise, her expression shocked. It's for you. Denise stared. For her. Carla handed her the receiver with shaky fingers. Denise swallowed hard and pressed it to her ear. This is Denise. A deep voice spoke on the other end. Miss Walker. Her blood ran cold, because she knew that voice. It wasn't the captain. It wasn't corporate. It was Leonard Montgomery, the owner of the airline. The man she had just humiliated. Denise's breath hitched. Yes, sir. A pause. Then, in the same calm voice he had used before, he spoke. I changed my mind. Denise's heart stopped. What? Another pause. Then, the words that would change everything. You're not getting off with security anymore. The shift in power. Denise gripped the in-flight phone like it was the only thing keeping her upright. You're not getting off with security anymore. Leonard Montgomery's voice had been calm, too calm. A statement, not a request. Her breath hitched. He changed his mind. Why? Her stomach twisted as she forced herself to respond. I don't understand. Leonard let out a small exhale over the phone, as if he already knew she would say that. No, Miss Walker, you don't. And then, click. The line went dead. Denise stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, her pulse pounding. She turned toward Carla, who had been standing nearby, watching her with wide eyes. What the hell just happened? Carla asked. Denise shook her head. She had no idea. Leonard Montgomery had just spared her. But why did it feel like he had just made things worse? An audience waiting for a verdict. Denise turned back toward the first-class cabin. Passengers were still watching, some subtly peeking over their newspapers, others whispering. The tension in the air was so thick it was suffocating. Leonard Montgomery hadn't moved from seat 1A. He sat perfectly composed, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just upended her entire world. Denise's hands clenched at her sides. She needed to say something, do something. But what? The captain had just ordered her removal. Leonard had just overruled it. Who the hell was actually in charge here? For the first time in her career, she had no control. And that terrified her. The weight of an unspoken lesson. Denise took a slow, shaky breath and stepped toward 1A. Passengers pretended to be absorbed in their own business, but she knew better. They were waiting for the fallout. She reached Leonard's seat, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Montgomery." He looked up. His expression gave nothing away. Denise swallowed. "Why?" Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Why what?" Her throat tightened. "Why did you change your mind?" He studied her for a moment, his fingers tapping once against his armrest. "Would you rather I hadn't?" Denise's pulse spiked. What kind of question was that? She shifted uncomfortably. "No. She struggled for words. "Don't understand." Leonard tilted his head slightly. "Because you think I should punish you." Her mouth went dry. Because yes, she did. She had spent the last hour humiliating this man, treating him like an imposter, doubting his right to be here. And yet, he had let her. And now, when he could have easily ended her career, he hadn't. Leonard exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "People like you always expect the worst." Denise flinched. "People like me." She bristled but forced herself to keep quiet. Leonard continued, his voice smooth, controlled. "You think power is about punishment, about consequences. But the truth is," he leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers, "power is knowing when to let someone live with their mistakes." The words hit her harder than she expected. Her stomach twisted, because she knew. Deep down. That he was right. If he had let security remove her, if he had let the airline fire her, she would have spent years blaming him. She would have told herself that he was vindictive, that he was just another arrogant billionaire. But now she had to sit with the truth. And the truth was, she had been wrong. Leonard Montgomery hadn't needed to prove anything. She had. And she had failed. Denise's hands trembled slightly. "So, what now?" Leonard leaned back, watching her carefully. "That depends." She frowned. "On what?" A slow smirk played at the corner of his lips. "On whether you actually learned something." Denise stiffened, because suddenly she realized this wasn't over. Not even close. The shift in dynamics. Denise returned to the galley, her entire body tense. Carla and Michael were waiting for her. Michael raised an eyebrow. "So, are you getting kicked off, or what?" Denise ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. "No." Carla's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" "I thought the captain." Montgomery overruled him. Michael let out a low whistle. "Damn." Carla blinked. Why would he do that? Denise's jaw clenched. "I don't know." But that was a lie. Because she did know. Leonard Montgomery hadn't spared her. He had made her a lesson. And now she had to live with it. She turned back toward the curtains separating the galley from first class. Passengers were still watching, waiting. And suddenly, Denise understood. Leonard hadn't just changed the course of her career. He had changed the way the entire plane saw him. No one in first class would ever look at him the same way again. Because they had all sat there and watched her doubt him. And none of them had said anything. Denise swallowed hard. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all of them. And Leonard Montgomery had just taught them all a lesson they would never forget. A quiet message. Denise took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and did something she had never done before. She grabbed a glass, filled it with sparkling water, added a lemon wedge, and walked back to 1A. She carefully placed the drink on Leonard's tray table, ensuring it was perfect. He didn't look up immediately. But when he did, there was something in his gaze. Not amusement, not arrogance, just understanding. Denise took a slow breath. And then, in the calmest voice she had managed all night, she said, "I know an apology isn't enough, Mr. Montgomery, but I was wrong. And I appreciate your patience more than I deserve." A few passengers stiffened. Leonard tapped his finger against the armrest, watching her carefully. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. Not in forgiveness, not in approval, just in acknowledgement. And somehow, that was worse. Denise turned to walk away. But just as she did, Leonard spoke. "Denise." She froze, turned back. Her heart pounded. Leonard leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the armrest. "Do you know why I changed my mind?" She swallowed hard. "No." He tapped his fingers against the tray table. "Because accountability means more than punishment." The words settled deep into her chest. Leonard Montgomery wasn't just teaching her a lesson. He was making sure she would never forget it. And as she walked back toward the galley, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her, she knew she never would. The weight of the moment. Denise walked away from seat 1A with her heart pounding in her chest. She had expected anger. She had expected punishment. But not this. Leonard Montgomery had made it clear he wasn't here to ruin her. He was here to teach her. And somehow, that was worse. Because punishment would have been easier. If he had let security take her off the plane, she could have blamed him. If he had called corporate and had her fired, she could have justified it. But now she had to live with it. She had to carry what she had done, knowing that she had been completely wrong, and knowing that he had chosen to spare her anyway. She reached the galley, gripping the counter to steady herself. Carla and Michael were still watching her. Michael frowned. "You okay?" Denise let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "No." Carla exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Denise, what the hell just happened?" Denise shook her head, because she still wasn't sure how to explain it. She wasn't kicked off the plane. She wasn't fired, yet. But she also wasn't off the hook. Far from it. Leonard Montgomery had given her something worse than punishment. A chance to change. And the question now wasn't what he was going to do. It was what she was going to do next. A different kind of power. The first-class cabin had settled, but the energy had changed. Denise could feel it. The passengers weren't just looking at her differently. They were looking at Leonard differently, too. Because none of them had known who he was. None of them had realized that the quiet black man in seat 1A was the most powerful person in the room. And none of them had spoken up when she had challenged him. They had watched. They had let it happen. And now they were all sitting in the weight of their silence. Denise turned back toward the curtain. She had to do something. Something right. She grabbed a hot towel from the service tray, folded it neatly, and poured another glass of sparkling water. Then, carefully, she made her way back to 1A. This time, she wasn't walking like a flight attendant. She was walking like someone who had learned. She reached Leonard's seat and gently set the towel and water on his tray. Leonard glanced up, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. Denise took a deep breath and forced herself to meet his gaze. "I know an apology isn't enough, Mr. Montgomery." A pause. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. She continued, "But I was wrong. Completely. And I appreciate your patience more than I deserve." For a long moment, Leonard didn't speak. Then, slowly, he set his phone down. "You do realize," he said, "that this isn't just about you and me." Denise nodded, her throat tightening. "I do now." Leonard studied her. Then, finally, he nodded once. Not in forgiveness, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. And somehow, that was enough. The new lesson. Denise turned away, her hand still slightly shaking. She had made her apology. She had owned her mistake. But this wasn't just about her anymore. She walked back toward the galley, her mind racing. And for the first time since this flight began, she wasn't thinking about her job. She was thinking about who she had been before today, and who she was going to be after. Because Leonard Montgomery had just given her something more valuable than a second chance. He had given her a mirror, and she was never going to look at herself the same way again. The aftermath. Denise had spent her entire career believing she was in control, that she could read people, that she understood power. But tonight, she had been wrong. And the worst part, she hadn't even realized it. Not until Leonard Montgomery had forced her to see it. As she moved back toward the galley, she felt the weight of the first-class cabin pressing against her back. The passengers weren't whispering anymore. They were silent, because they had all just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. A power shift that wasn't loud or aggressive. It had been quiet, subtle, a moment that had forced everyone to rethink their assumptions. Not just about Leonard, but about themselves. The echo of a mistake. The galley was dimly lit, a small sanctuary from the heavy atmosphere in first class. Denise leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly, trying to steady herself. Carla and Michael were still standing there, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Okay, you have to tell us. What did he say?" Denise's mouth felt dry. She swallowed. "He said, power isn't about punishment." Carla frowned. "What does that even mean?" Denise let out a humorless laugh. "It means he wanted me to live with what I did." Michael whistled. "Dan." Carla crossed her arms. "So, he's not going to get you fired?" Denise shook her head. "I don't know." And that was the truth. Leonard Montgomery had spared her from being escorted off the plane. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. There always were. She had spent years in this industry, and if there was one thing she understood, it was that some mistakes followed you forever. And this was one of them. The captain's decision. Denise barely had time to process before the in-flight phone rang again. She and Carla exchanged glances. Michael sighed. "This flight is cursed." Carla answered, "Yes, Captain." A pause. Then she frowned. Understood. She turned to Denise, her expression unreadable. "The captain wants to see you again." Denise's stomach clenched. Michael muttered, "This just keeps getting worse." Denise forced her legs to move, walking toward the cockpit one last time. She knocked. The door opened immediately. Captain Reynolds was waiting, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. First Officer Patel didn't even try to pretend he wasn't listening. Denise stepped inside, standing as straight as she could. She was prepared for the worst, prepared for him to say she was done. But instead, Reynolds let out a long, slow breath and said something that shocked her. "You're staying on the flight." Denise blinked. "What?" Reynolds' jaw clenched. "You heard me." Her pulse spiked. "But I thought." "So did I." His voice was sharp, until Montgomery called corporate himself. Denise felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. Leonard Montgomery called corporate. Reynolds continued, "Do you have any idea what that means?" Denise shook her head. The captain's gaze was icy. "It means he doesn't want you fired. But that doesn't mean you're off the hook." Denise swallowed. "What does that mean?" Reynolds stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "It means you're going to finish this flight. And when we land, you'll report to corporate. They'll decide what happens next." Her chest tightened. "Sir, No." The captain cut her off. "No more talking. No more explaining. Just do your damn job." Denise nodded. And just like that, it was over. For now, back to the cabin. Denise stepped out of the cockpit, her heart still hammering. The passengers in first class were still watching, waiting to see if she was leaving. But when they saw her walking back to the galley instead of off the plane, some of them looked relieved, some of them looked confused, and some of them, they just looked ashamed. Because deep down, they knew. None of them had spoken up. Not when she was questioning Leonard. Not when she was wrong. They had let it happen. And that realization sat heavy on them, too. Denise reached the galley and leaned against the counter, exhaling. Carla raised an eyebrow. Well? Denise shook her head. I'm staying on the flight. Michael's eyes widened. No way. Carla frowned. Why? Denise hesitated. Then she answered. Because Montgomery made sure of it. Carla and Michael exchanged stunned glances. Michael let out a breath. That guy is playing chess while the rest of us are playing checkers. Denise couldn't disagree. Because Leonard Montgomery hadn't just spared her. He had controlled the entire situation from the moment he stepped on the plane. Without ever raising his voice. Without ever demanding recognition. And that kind of power, that kind of control, it was terrifying. The last move. Denise straightened her uniform, forcing herself to refocus. She had a job to do. Even if her entire world had shifted, she stepped out into first class and moved seat by seat, checking on passengers like nothing had happened. But when she reached 1A, she hesitated. Leonard Montgomery was still sitting there, calm, composed. He looked up, meeting her gaze. And then, he did something she didn't expect. He smirked. Not in arrogance, not in cruelty, but in understanding. Like he knew exactly what she was thinking. And maybe he did. Denise took a slow breath. Would you like anything else, Mr. Montgomery? Leonard tapped a single finger against the tray table, considering. Then, finally, he spoke. Just water, Miss Walker. Denise nodded, and for the first time all night, she felt like she understood. Leonard Montgomery hadn't spared her because he was merciful. He had spared her because he wanted her to remember this moment forever. And she would, because some lessons don't come from punishment. Some lessons come from knowing you were wrong, and having to live with it. The final verdict. The moment Flight 417 touched down at JFK International Airport, Denise felt like she was breathing borrowed air. She had spent the remainder of the flight pretending everything was normal. Serving drinks, checking on passengers, smiling when necessary. But nothing was normal. Not anymore. Because the second that seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began gathering their things, Denise knew she wasn't walking off this plane like she had every other time. She was walking straight into judgment. Corporate was waiting for her, and she had no idea what was about to happen next. The longest walk of her life. Denise kept her back straight as she moved through first class, collecting glasses, helping passengers with their luggage. She was aware of every single pair of eyes on her. Some of them looked at her with curiosity, some with sympathy, and some with guilt. Because they knew. They had sat there and watched her fail, and none of them had done a damn thing to stop it. Denise's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel it now, the weight of what had happened. The way the power in the room had shifted the moment they realized who Leonard Montgomery was. They had been so comfortable watching her question him, but the second they knew the truth, they had fallen silent. Not one person had spoken up for him, and that silence said more than any words ever could. The final goodbye. Passengers started filing out of the plane, disappearing into the jet bridge. Denise stood near the galley, pretending to be occupied with nothing. She was waiting, because there was still one passenger left. Leonard Montgomery. He hadn't moved from 1A. Instead, he sat calmly, watching as the cabin emptied around him. Denise exhaled, her heart hammering. Finally, Leonard stood. He adjusted his cuffs, grabbed his carry-on, and turned toward her. And then, in the same calm, unreadable voice, he spoke. Come with me. Denise blinked. Sir. Leonard's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You heard me. Denise's pulse spiked. She had spent the entire flight preparing for corporate, for a disciplinary meeting, for a possible termination. But not this. She hesitated. I don't think I should. Leonard raised an eyebrow. You'd rather let them decide your fate without you in the room. Denise froze. Because suddenly, she understood. Leonard Montgomery hadn't just changed her flight. He had changed everything. And now, whatever was about to happen next, it was happening on his terms, not hers. The meeting that wasn't supposed to happen. Denise followed Leonard through the jet bridge, her legs heavy. The air in the terminal was buzzing with the usual post-flight chaos. Gate agents working, passengers hurrying, people reuniting. But none of it mattered, because waiting just outside the gate was a team from corporate. 2 men, 1 woman, all wearing serious expressions, the kind that said they had already made a decision. Denise's stomach turned. This was it, the moment her career would be decided. One of the men stepped forward. Miss Walker, we need to speak with you. Leonard Montgomery didn't stop walking. He simply glanced at them and said, She's coming with me. Denise felt the air shift. The corporate representatives visibly stiffened. The woman hesitated. Sir, we were instructed to. Leonard cut her off with a simple tilt of his head. And that was all it took. No argument. No pushback. Because he was the final authority here. Not them. Not the captain. Not even the airline's policies. Leonard Montgomery owned everything. And now he was rewriting the rules. Behind closed doors. Denise barely processed where they were walking until she realized they were inside a private lounge. Not the ones meant for first-class passengers. The executive lounges. The ones flight attendants never saw. The kind only a handful of people in the world had access to. Leonard led her to a conference room, motioned for her to sit, and then took a seat across from her. For a long moment, he just studied her. Then, finally, he spoke. Do you understand why you're here? Denise swallowed hard. Because I messed up. Leonard's lips twitched slightly. That's the obvious answer. She frowned. And the real answer. Leonard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Because this was never just about you. Denise stiffened. Leonard tapped a single finger against the table. Tell me something, Miss Walker. How many times have you done this before? She flinched, because she knew exactly what he meant. She had questioned him, assumed things about him, doubted his place in first class. And if she was being honest, he wasn't the first. Leonard nodded, as if reading her silence. You think I'm angry because you disrespected me. He shook his head. I'm angry because you didn't even question why you thought I didn't belong. Denise couldn't breathe. Because this was the real lesson. Not about her job, not about her career, but about the way she had seen the world. And the way the world had seen him. She clenched her jaw. I can do better. Leonard's gaze didn't waver. Then prove it. The unexpected verdict. Denise braced herself for the final decision. She expected him to tell her she was fired. That she would never work for this airline again. That she had destroyed everything. But Leonard Montgomery had never been predictable. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and slid it across the table. Denise hesitated before picking it up. She read it once. Then again. Her breath hitched. Because it wasn't a termination notice. It wasn't a disciplinary order. It was an invitation to an executive training program with his personal signature. Denise's eyes snapped up. You want me to train with corporate? Leonard's voice was calm. I want you to learn what power actually looks like. Her heart raced. This wasn't a punishment. This was a chance. A real one. Leonard exhaled, standing up. You don't have to take it. Denise stared at the card. Everything she had built was on the line. her career, her reputation, but more than that, her integrity. She looked back at Leonard, and then, finally, she nodded. "I want to learn." Leonard smirked slightly. "Good." He turned to leave, and just before he stepped out of the room, he spoke one last time. "Don't waste this opportunity, Miss Walker." Then he was gone. Denise stared down at the card, her hands shaking. Her career had changed. Her life had changed. And all because one man had chosen to teach her a lesson instead of ending her story. She exhaled sharply, because she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.